Have you ever witnessed an elderly man fighting against the banking system just because he's not tech-savvy? A man who's spent his entire life helping the next generation, yet is denied access to his own money when his wife's life depends on it. In today's video, we follow the emotional journey of Coach Walter Thompson, a forgotten legend, as he battles against the unfair policies of a major bank. Can he reclaim what's rightfully his? Watch as an NBA hero and a teenage girl step up to make a life-changing decision. Don't miss this intense showdown that no one saw coming. Walter Thompson entered First Capital Bank for the third time this month. His weary steps echoed across the silent lobby, the cold fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on his anxious face. The elderly man, with white hair and hands weathered by time, paused at the counter. He took a deep breath, bracing himself to face the bank teller. This time, when Walter spoke, his voice was frail and pleading. "Please. I've been coming here for 30 years. Every time, I see Ms. Sarah. She knows me, she remembers me." But instead of understanding, he was met with a cold, unfeeling gaze from the young teller across from him. "Sir, I've told you 3 times already. There are no exceptions," the teller responded, her tone as icy as the glass barrier separating them. "Without updated digital identification, we cannot grant you access to your account. Those are the rules." Other customers stood around, watching from a distance, but none moved to help. Walter tried to hold on to the last shred of dignity he had left. With trembling hands, he fumbled through his pocket, pulling out a stack of worn papers, old utility bills, a faded veteran ID, and a tattered Social Security letter. He held them out toward the teller, hoping they might somehow grant him access to his own savings. But one of the trembling papers slipped from his hand, falling onto the cold counter. Walter bent down slowly to pick up each piece, those papers that had stayed with him through the years, now seemingly worthless in the indifferent eyes of the younger employees around him. Each word he spoke felt like another blow to his pride. "Please," his voice choked with desperation, "I only need a small portion of my own money. I have no one else to turn to. Please, help me." But his pleas faded into the bank's cold, unyielding silence. A security guard approached, roughly guiding him toward the exit. He was pushed outside, collapsing onto the hard sidewalk. A veteran who had fought his whole life was now defeated by a heartless system. Walter's trembling hands spread out on the pavement like fallen autumn leaves, fragile and hopeless. Some bystanders started to approach him to help, but the bank guard's sharp voice stopped them. "Sir, you're disturbing the peace." The booming voice echoed through the high ceiling, overpowering the murmurs of concerned onlookers. "My wife's medication," Walter's voice cracked with anguish. Tears welled up in his aging eyes. He refused to let go of the counter. "The pharmacy closes at 5. I just need to access my pension, it's right here, in my account." The footsteps of passers-by outside began to slow. Their eyes followed the scene inside the bank through the glass doors. Some stopped altogether, raising their phones to record the image of the old man struggling against the security guards and cold, unfeeling rules. Inside the bank, customers stood watching, some turning away in discomfort, while others glared in anger. A young mother shielded her child's eyes, unwilling to let him witness the heartbreaking sight, while an elderly woman clutched her pearl necklace, muttering, "This isn't right. This isn't right, that's enough." A second security guard shouted, grabbing Walter's elbow. "If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to escort you out." Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Walter's tears began to flow freely down his time-worn face. He was dragged toward the door, his wooden cane tapping sharply on the marble floor with each slow, stumbling step. Cold sweat mixed with tears, falling with each final step he took in the bank he had trusted for 30 years. Outside, Walter froze, staring at the building he once believed held his security. In front of him, papers scattered across the pavement, quietly telling the story of his life, simple pieces of paper like his Social Security letter, his worn veteran ID, and bank statements, each one carrying the years of his service to his country, to his family. The reason for this desperate visit was simple yet heartbreaking. His wife, Margaret, had just been switched to a new chemotherapy regimen. Walter only needed a small amount of money to buy her the medication she needed, but all he received was rejection, cold and callous. He looked up at the gray sky, gripping his cane tightly, his tear-filled eyes full of despair. In that moment, he realized that sometimes it's not life or fate that breaks a person, it's the heartlessness of rules that lack soul. That morning, weak sunlight filtered through the large glass windows of First Capital Bank, but it could not dissipate the heavy tension that hung over the lobby. Walter Thompson, tall yet slightly hunched from the weight of years, stood in the crowded room. His eyes, still holding a glimmer of fragile hope, were fixed on the counter. The new prescription, worth $486, needed to be filled before the weekend. The Anderson Pharmacy, where he and his wife always went, would close at 5 p.m. But the clock on the bank's wall read 3 p.m. Time seemed to race against his desperation. Mr. Thompson. A sharp voice cut through the noise. Rebecca Stevens, the newly appointed bank manager, stepped out of her office with the confident stride of a powerful woman. At 34, she was a rising star in the National Financial Group, renowned for her ability to implement security protocols efficiently. Her reputation for uncompromising rule enforcement had earned her this position 3 months ago, after a major merger. Walter looked at her with a steady yet patient gaze, standing firm as if all his years of basketball training had helped him retain some dignity under pressure. Ms. Stevens, I've tried to explain to your staff that I've been banking here since 1989. All the old employees know me. But now I'm being denied access to my own money. Rebecca, dressed in a neat suit with a cold, indifferent look in her eyes, gestured toward her office, a modern space with sleek glass walls. Please, come in, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Walter, gripping his wooden cane tightly, followed her slowly. Behind him, 2 security guards kept a cautious distance, their eyes tracking his every unsteady step. Once inside the office, Rebecca sat behind a large desk. Mr. Thompson, she began, her fingers quickly typing on the keyboard to access his account information. I understand that you're trying to withdraw from your pension account. However, the records show that you have not completed the required digital verification upgrade. We've sent you 4 notifications regarding these changes. Walter nodded slowly, his eyes filled with exhaustion and pain. Yes. I remember those letters. They had green borders, right? My wife, Margaret, tried to help me with the computer part. But she's been so sick lately. The chemotherapies drained her, his voice broke, choked with worry. Rebecca paused briefly, her gaze sweeping over Walter's weathered face and trembling hands. But even that brief moment of acknowledgement did little to soften her stern demeanor. I'm sorry to hear about your wife, she said, her voice unchanged. However, we cannot bypass the procedure. You need to complete the digital verification in order to access your account. Walter lowered his head, his hands gripping his cane as though it were the only thing holding him up against the absolute coldness of the system. Please, he murmured, his voice growing faint, almost a whisper. I just need this money, to buy medicine for my wife. Rebecca's eyes flicked to the computer screen, where an emergency security alert flashed bright red. The bank's new security system, implemented during the merger with National Financial, required all accounts to undergo enhanced digital verification, including 2 biometric scans and 2-factor authentication through a smartphone app. The process was strict, with no exceptions. Rebecca spoke gently but firmly, Mr. Thompson, the new security policy is in place to protect users from fraud risks, especially the elderly. Under federal regulations, we cannot verify your identity without completing these digital steps. Walter gripped his cane tightly, his hands trembling, not just from age but from the bitter frustration of feeling trapped. I have my driver's license, my veteran ID card, and even a copy of the account opening contract from 1989. Isn't that enough to prove who I am? Rebecca sighed and shook her head. I'm sorry, but physical documents no longer suffice. Our security system requires digital verification through a security app. This is a legal liability issue, and the company has a clear policy on it. She turned the computer screen toward Walter so he could see the system's complex requirements. It displayed steps like installing the verification app, registering biometric data, and setting up two-factor authentication. It was a modern process that seemed impossible for him, a man who still used an old flip phone that he and his wife, Margaret, had relied on for years. Walter lifted his head, his voice trembling with helplessness, but I don't have a smartphone. Margaret and we've only needed this old phone, until now. Rebecca felt her palms tighten, her fingers pressing firmly on the keyboard, almost as if she were trying to reassure herself. That morning, an email from headquarters had reminded her of the new security rules, haunting her with the knowledge that any violation could jeopardize her position. Her career and mortgage loans all depended on strict compliance. Perhaps a family member could help you set up the digital verification process, Rebecca suggested, knowing full well that the procedure would take days to complete. Walter looked at her, his eyes filled with the weariness and concern of the years. My son is stationed in Germany, and Margaret's sister can't come until next week to help her. But this prescription, Walter trembled as he placed the prescription on Rebecca's desk, this prescription can't wait until next week. Rebecca could see Walter's account information displayed on the screen. It was right there, in front of her, but the bank's new policy was like an invisible wall standing between Walter and the money he desperately needed. Inside, she felt a tug of conflict, but her voice remained steady and firm. Walter Thompson's decades of careful savings, built from modest pension checks, now hung in limbo, suspended by the flashing red warning banners on the screen, signaling that access to his account had been restricted. In the glass-walled office, Rebecca could feel the gaze of other customers watching this exchange. Those who knew Walter saw more than just the elderly, helpless man before them. To them, he was the dedicated coach who had tirelessly contributed to the community, buying uniforms for poor children, writing college recommendation letters, and showing up at graduation ceremonies like a second father. Each tick of the wall clock seemed to emphasize Walter's desperation. The pharmacy closed at 5 p.m., and with every passing second, they were one step closer to the risk that Margaret wouldn't get her medication in time. The security system the bank prided itself on had become an iron grip, tightening around Walter and his family, pushing them into an impossible situation. Rebecca tried to maintain her professional demeanor, but the tension hung heavy in the air. She stood up, weighing the situation. If she continued to refuse, Walter could create a very uncomfortable scene, but breaking security protocol could cost her everything. Outside, as the standoff continued, the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal, former NBA legend, appeared in the parking lot with his daughter, Mahira, making their way toward the bank. They noticed Walter, the elderly man sitting silently on a bench near the entrance. His shoulders trembled with sobs, a sturdy wooden cane held firmly in his hands, and scattered papers lay around his feet like forgotten pieces of a broken life. Mahira tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering, "Dad, look. Why is he crying in the middle of the day like this?" Shaquille stopped in his tracks, his massive frame casting a shadow over the scene. "Sir, are you okay?" His deep voice echoed, full of concern, a sharp contrast to his imposing stature. Walter looked up, hurriedly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to hold on to whatever dignity he had left. "I'm sorry," his voice quivered as he bent down to gather the scattered papers. "My wife, Margaret, she needs her medicine. But the bank, they won't let me withdraw my money." Mahira knelt down, helping him collect the papers. She picked up a photograph, studied it closely, and gasped, "Dad, look. This is Coach Thompson. They were talking about him at camp this morning." Shaquille bent down too, his expression shifting as the pieces started to fall into place. The stories he had heard from the community now came into focus, about a man who had spent his life helping poor kids, keeping them in the game, working extra jobs to support youth programs. The man before him was no longer just an elderly, helpless man, it was a forgotten legend, Walter Thompson. Shaquille lowered himself even further, his gaze full of compassion. "Mr. Thompson, don't worry. I'll help you. Today, we won't let Mrs. Margaret wait another second." Walter quietly explained to Shaquille the difficult situation he was facing. He was dealing with the bank's new digital verification requirement, while Margaret, his wife, was waiting at home for her medication. His voice seemed to fade, each word weighed down by the decades of loyalty he had shown by banking here, and now, this very place was treating him like a stranger. Mahira, holding her phone, was focused on reading the bank's policy terms. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp with the conviction of youth, something only those who truly seek justice possess. Shaquille nodded slowly. The pain of his own experience echoing in him as he remembered his sister, who had lost her battle with cancer. He felt deeply the meaning in every word Walter spoke. Shaquille leaned forward, offering his hand to help Walter stand up, his grip strong and reassuring. "Mr. Thompson, let's go back in there. Sometimes, people need to be reminded that behind every policy, there's a person." As the three of them headed back toward the bank, other customers began to take notice, phones raised to snap pictures, and the story quickly spread on social media like wildfire. Whispers passed from one to the next, and the presence of the NBA legend, the teenager filming everything, and the dignified older coach created a powerful, emotional scene in the bank's lobby. Rebecca Stevens, seeing them from her office, paused mid-motion when they entered. She could feel the atmosphere change instantly. This was no longer just a small policy issue, it had become a larger ethical challenge, a confrontation that was testing both Walter and the bank. Shaquille's voice echoed down the hallway, "I think it's time we take a hard look at what this bank really means to the community." Rebecca looked around, clutching her tablet tightly, but the tension was impossible to hide. She tried to regain her composure and began speaking with the trained tone of a professional banker. "Mr. O'Neill, I understand your concern, but there are federal regulations we cannot." Shaquille cut her off, his voice powerful and unwavering. "Let me tell you something, Rebecca. I've sat on the boards of many banks, been involved in countless mergers and acquisitions. And I know exactly what federal regulations say, and what they don't." The room seemed to hold its breath as bank employees gathered around, their faces pale and tense. What began as a normal Monday afternoon had now turned into a dramatic battle of wits, like a courtroom where Shaquille was both the judge and jury. He leaned toward Rebecca, his deep voice resounding with authority. "So, tell me, what really matters here?" Shaquille silently pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through Walter Thompson's account history, his voice filled with command and no room for compromise. "I just reviewed Coach Thompson's transaction history with this bank. 43 years, never overdraft, regular deposits, every transaction completely in order. Enough to verify his identity, a man who has been loyal to this bank for 4 decades. Mahira was still recording everything, the camera slowly zooming in on Shaquille's modern phone and Walter's old passbook. The image stood as a powerful metaphor for the clash between modern technology and human dignity. Shaquille continued, his voice a mix of sadness and frustration. "I understand the meaning of sitting here, watching time tick by, while the bureaucracy runs its course, slow as water flowing through a mill. Every minute we stand here arguing over digital signatures, his wife is at home, waiting for life-saving medication." Rebecca, nervous, her hands slightly trembling as she picked up her tablet, murmured, "Sir, I understand the emotional aspect, but..." Shaquille stood tall, imposing and statuesque. The bank employees instinctively stepped back as his voice grew strong and unwavering. "From where I stand, I see a bank that's lost its purpose. A bank is not just about protecting money, it's about safeguarding trust." He pointed to the lobby where customers had gathered, capturing every moment on their phones. "Look out there. Everyone knows Coach Thompson. They trust him with their children, their futures. But the place where he's entrusted his trust and his savings for decades doesn't trust him enough to let him access his own money. The hum of the air conditioning filled the tense silence. Rebecca could feel the temperature rise in the room, her face flushing red as she realized this was no longer just about one customer, it was about the reputation of the bank in the digital age, where a single video could destroy a brand. Shaquille took a deep breath, his voice shifting from forceful to resolute. We will get Coach Thompson his money today. And tomorrow, you all will have to reconsider every digital policy you've implemented to ensure that human dignity always comes before convenience. If not, he paused, letting the silence settle, his eyes full of determination. I'll help him move every cent to a bank that remembers its community. Rebecca felt the weight of every word. She lowered her head, her hand trembling as she took Walter's passbook. Coach Thompson, she said sincerely, I'll process your withdrawal immediately. We'll use the emergency protocol, and I'll take responsibility for any mistakes. As the transaction was completed, Shaquille noticed a familiar image on Walter's phone, a blurry photo from 1985, showing Walter coaching a tall, lean young man, who later became an NBA star. Shaquille raised an eyebrow, recognizing the moment. Walter smiled briefly, I taught him how to hit the unblockable skyhook. Shaquille laughed deeply, his rich, nostalgic chuckle breaking the tension in the room. This man gave me more than a few headaches back in '96. The clock read 4:53 p.m. Walter had the money he needed. He turned to Shaquille, his eyes filled with deep emotion. I don't know how to thank you, he said, his voice trembling. Margaret is all I have left, and this medication, it's our last hope. Shaquille shook Rebecca's hand, thanking her for doing the right thing, and as they all stepped outside, Shaquille unexpectedly stopped at the ATM, quickly withdrew some cash, and handed it to Walter. Walter tried to refuse, but Shaquille raised his hand to stop him. Think of it as an investment in the Skyhook legacy, my friend. Mahira silently watched the two men, one towering like a monument, the other bent with age but still unyielding. In that final handshake, under the sunset, she realized that the greatest victories don't come from game-winning shots, but from small acts of kindness, filled with humanity. How would you react if you saw an elderly person being turned away just because they weren't tech-savvy? Do you think the bank should have helped Walter instead of leaving him to figure it out? Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for your continued support of the channel. We truly appreciate each and every one of you. As we create content, there may be small errors, and we hope you'll kindly overlook them. Wishing everyone happiness, peace, and good health in life. Stay tuned for more.